Can everybody hear me okay? No? Don't touch it. We're going to be fighting their audio. Okay. Hello? That's better. How's that? Nope. Hello? Is that better? People in the back? Good, good. Okay. Okay. I'll try to shout. Okay. I think that's better. Okay, let me know if you can't hear me. I'll speak as loud as I can here. My name is Aaron Ladage. I am here to talk to you today about Postprocessors. I've given this talk a few times, and every time when I was actually developing this talk, I had this actual nightmare where I woke up in the middle of the night, and I had given the hour talk. I'd said we're going to learn about Postprocessors, and I went through an hour on it, and then at the end, somebody in the back raised their hands and said, what's a preprocessor? In other words, didn't even know what they were going away from. So my hope is that everybody's got an idea of preprocessors, and if not, we'll do a little bit of history here so we can walk through this. But as I said, my name's Aaron, with a very hard to pronounce last name of Ladage. I work for a company called DEG in Kansas City, Missouri. Go Royals, had to throw that in there. And my team actually moved over to this concept of post-processing and transpiling about 8 months ago now. So we've got a little bit of experience with it. And so I put this talk together to hopefully walk anybody who's curious about this topic through it and give them some ideas and pitfalls on what can go right and wrong. I did notice this is a very long room with a medium-sized screen and quite a bit of light coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and throw my slides up here in case anybody needs to follow along on their laptops. It's bit.ly/1 capital MP MZ capital RW. So feel free to follow along on your laptops if needed. So there's this great quote from Stephen King, which has been said by a million people, but I like to throw a giant Stephen King photo up there, which is that sooner or later, everything old is new again. And in the case of the web, I think that's very true. Everything that once was kind of becomes again, and it has a funny way of getting back to its roots. So we talk about two concepts a lot when we talk about web development, especially front-end development, which is we have standards, or we have web standards, or our best practices, and then we have emerging technology, and we have innovation. And a lot of times I think that this is a linear process, that this always goes from standards to emerging, or the other way around. But I actually see it as being a bit more cyclical. We have our web standards. We have what is advised as the best way to do something. And inevitably, something is going to come up that can't be done. We've all been in that situation, right, where we are trying to follow best practices, but it just can't be done that way. But developers are a pretty clever group. And they will inevitably find a way to do it, even if they have to break outside of standards just a little bit. And that's really how we get emerging technologies. We go from this concept of here's the best way to do this, and here's how we can kind of move beyond that. In a perfect world, if we're lucky, the standards makers take notice of this. And what they actually do is refine the good stuff, toss out the bad stuff, and eventually it makes its way back into standards. So that's a really nice, clean, perfect circle that we hope is happening. So I think that technological expansion and contraction is really a natural reaction to two things. One is current browser limitations, and the second is the pace of new feature adoption by browser manufacturers. So I'm going to make a couple controversial statements here. I'm hoping I can frustrate a few people. The first concept, I'm going to basically introduce two concepts where I think this has happened in the history of the web. And the first was Flash. And I'm going to come right out and say, Flash was a great thing. That felt really gross to say. I kind of mean it. I don't really mean it, but I kind of mean it. We're all familiar with Flash. And I hope no one here worked for this company or works for this company. Somebody at one point thought that this was a pretty good idea for building a website. And this is actually still live. Please, if you work there, I apologize. If you watch really close, the little penguin up front will hop every few seconds. Here, I'll laser point him. Come on, buddy. There he goes. Kind of cute, actually, right? So somebody thought this was a pretty good idea at one time. And obviously, Flash had its issues. Flash kind of sucked. But when you think about Flash, I think Flash gets ragged on a lot nowadays, but when you think about Flash historically, Flash also gave us some things. It gave us streaming video before we had access to HTML5 video. It gave us animation before we had access to CSS3 transitions and animations. And it gave us these really rich interactive experiences, for better or for worse, before we really had robust JavaScript ways of interacting with the page. So when you think about Flash, Flash bridged a functionality gap. And ultimately, it encouraged the web standards to take a look at the standards and say, we're not meeting what the developers and the clients are actually needing. So it encouraged the web standards to catch up. The second kind of example of this that I want to point out has to do with this gentleman, a man named Ethan Marcotte that hopefully you've all heard of. He coined that term for an article in A List Apart back in 2010. Hard to believe it's 5 years ago. Seems short and long. And there's 3 tenets to responsive design that hopefully as front-end developers you guys are familiar with: fluid grids, media queries, and last but not least, the concept of flexible images. And it's that third point that I actually want to speak to. So in his original article, Marcotte said that responsive images were a key tenet of responsive design. But there's one problem. The group that makes the standards didn't really see the issue with the limitations of images as they were available in the beginning. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the history of the responsive images and the picture element, but if there was a Lifetime movie about this, it might get the lowest ratings of all time, but I think you could make a Lifetime movie out of the history of the HTML5 picture element. There was a group of developers, Marcotte included in that group, as well as a group called Filament Group, that were working on the Boston Globe redesign. And they were actually designing that site as sort of a proof that responsive web design could succeed even on large-scale sites like the Boston Globe. So they saw shortcomings in the image tag and what we could actually do with that tag. The problem was the 2 groups that set the standards, the W3C and the group I still cannot pronounce to this day, the Whatwig, showed very little interest in actually coming up with a better solution than what we already had. And they suggested that those developers form a committee. And has anybody ever been in an organization where you were told, that's a great idea, go form a committee? That's the death knell of your idea, right? But they actually took it pretty seriously, and they formed what was called the Responsive Images Working Group. And they did come up with, them and some other groups came up with a couple of solutions. One was the picture element, and one was source set. At the time, those were actually sort of competing ideas. They had some similarities and some differences. Again, they were rejected by the Whatwig. There was another standard that they proposed called Source that I didn't even really see very much of, but it was an idea that was shopped around. During that time, something interesting kind of happened, though. So while they're fighting with the standards makers, a polyfill emerges. And that polyfill was called PictureFill. And it's still available today, and it was released by Filament Group, one of the groups that was involved with the Boston Globe in the first place. So it started showing up in the wild. Developers started actually using PictureFill. And suddenly, lo and behold, we started getting an actual picture element. So there was this combined, and it actually combined several of the ideas, which was the picture and the source set as a single solution. And we started seeing browser support late last year. So in the case of responsive images, developers and innovation drove the standards, not the other way around, similar to Flash. Call me crazy, but I think we're kind of on the edge of another great reevaluation and contraction in front-end development. So, as we all know, everybody in here has worked with HTML or with CSS and JavaScript before, and we've been filling in the gaps on these 2 languages for years. We've all heard this statement, right? CSS is not a real programming language. JavaScript is a toy language. Right? That one's starting to fade maybe a little bit. What problems do we actually have with these languages? Well, let's start with CSS. We obviously have cross-browser compatibility issues. Now, this is not a problem with CSS in and of itself, but if you're going to work with CSS, it's obviously still an issue. Vendor prefixes. When we have ideas that are coming out in the browsers that are not yet caught up with the web standards, we have to prefix things. No variables, the most basic building block of any programming language, is not present in native CSS. No inline importing. What I mean by that is somebody will probably argue and say, no, you can do @import and that will load in. But that's essentially a lazy load, right? That's just loading another CSS file. No nested selectors. In other words, we have to write out our styles very longhand. No functions. Speaking of basic building blocks of any programming language, name another programming language that doesn't have functions. No color manipulation. We're working with a language that's specifically designed to help us with layout and design, and we can't actually manipulate color at runtime. And again, no basic arithmetic, kind of similar to functions, but a little bit different. I'm going to talk about problems with JavaScript in two different groups. First of all, problems with it in the browser. Some would argue that it has a little bit of a messy syntax, especially with interacting with the DOM. And I want to speak of this a little bit historically too, because remember that a lot of the frustration with JavaScript dates back to Internet Explorer 6 or 5 or even before that. So not necessarily modern browsers, but historically we've had issues with messy syntax. Again, cross-browser compatibility issues. Historically, a more difficult DOM traversal. Difficulty with effects and animation in the raw language. And then let's talk about the language itself. So not anything to do with that interacting with the DOM API, but just with JavaScript in general. No module loading system. There's no great way to do dependency management and module loading natively in the language, historically. Quirky type coercion, the big one with JavaScript everybody knows about. And then some things that you could argue are kind of syntactic sugar, but we'll get to that in a sec. Things like no interpolation or being able to use template strings, no fat arrow functions, no default function arguments. Seems like a basic one, but a little tricky in JavaScript. No classes, and I will gladly talk to anybody who wants to talk about why classes are not necessary with prototypal inheritance anyway, but it's there. And no constants, and no destructuring. So we were in this situation where we're using two languages that are not actually all that full-featured for what we need to do with the web. So developers, again, found a solution. They found a way. And preprocessors really became the solution to that. And honestly, they're a pretty good solution, considering what we had to work with. On the CSS end of things, you saw things like SASS and less and stylus. I'll be talking primarily about SASS today because that was my experience previously. And here's another one of my piss everybody off slides, because CoffeeScript developers probably are not the kind of people who like being lumped in with Jquery developers. But we found these solutions that solved a problem on the preprocessing end. And I'm throwing Jquery in as a preprocessor, even though it's not really. But if you think about Jquery, it's entirely a convenience language for the developers. It doesn't provide a lot of value to our site visitors. It's entirely a way to ease the process of development on the site. So in a preprocessor world, we have a kind of a three-step process. The first is that the developer writes code in the preprocessor's proprietary syntax. And I want you to remember the word proprietary because I think that's a key to all of this. And then somewhere in that process, you have a task runner. And that could be anything from Grunt or Gulp or Fly.js or Broccoli, whatever you happen to use. I'm throwing Grunt in here. That's been our traditional workflow at my company. We're still holdouts on Grunt, believe it or not. But any preprocessor is the equation here. And finally, standards-based CSS is what's output by the task runner, and that's what is actually fed to the browser. So our browser obviously is never going to see SASS. So this is going to be very small, and I apologize for that. But in a SASS environment, you would say something like @include display flex. And for anyone who's used SASS before, that's actually part of the Compass library, which automatically prefixes everything we need to use Flexbox in modern browsers. And we're saying background color, and then I have $color blue, which is just your standard issue SASS variable structure. We run it through our task runner, and what we get back is display WebKit box, display WebKit flex, display MS Flexbox, then the correct non-prefix display flex, and you'll see our background color has been spit out as a variable. So that's our process, right? We write in this proprietary syntax and we spit out prefixed code, properly rendered out CSS code, so we've got CSS at the end of the day. I'm not a CoffeeScript guy, never was, but I'll run through it real quick. CoffeeScript allows us this much cleaner structure, gets rid of things like brackets and semicolons, is more space-based, and lets you do some things that you can't do in native JavaScript, which compiles out to this when you run it through your CoffeeScript preprocessor. On the library front, I want to talk real quickly about Jquery. And again, historically, it was a little more tricky to interact with the DOM. We basically had things like get element by ID in the predating old versions of IE. With Jquery, we got this nice clean syntax, which was just $ and then what you're trying to select. So a much cleaner selection environment. But preprocessors perpetuate a problem. It's hard to say. We're putting more and more layers of abstraction between the code that we write and the code that we're trying to put out and get out to the browser. So let's look at a few issues with preprocessors. For one thing, they're their own programming languages. I'm arguing here that they're not real code. Obviously, they are real code, but they're not real web code. They're not written in languages that the browser can read and that typical front-end developers are very familiar with writing. They use a proprietary syntax. If you are writing Sass, you are writing to Sass's spec. You're not necessarily writing to any sort of web standard. Again, often not written in, or they're often written in non-web languages such as Ruby. Obviously, Ruby is a web language, but in terms of front-end development, not the friendliest to a lot of front-end developers. Because of this, potentially buggy and more difficult to troubleshoot because the people who are trying to interact with it may not have familiarity with the code that they're trying to write. Not as easily extensible. Obviously, on the Sass front, you do have things like Compass, and there are big libraries like that that have been written, but again, it takes a little more know-how of the native language in order to be able to do that. And they must be compiled today and forever is kind of the key point here. Another issue is that the browsers are catching up. Are we doing things with our preprocessors that we really don't need anymore? And compile times. I don't know how large scale of projects anybody's working on. I work on some fairly sizable projects with my company, and compile times can be really slow. There's this great tweet from a gentleman named Ben Frayne, who's kind of on the Post Css bandwagon, who, just an estimate, said he's losing about 16 minutes of productivity a day to Sass compile times. You figure, yeah, 5 seconds is no big deal, but if you're hitting save, 200 times a day, that adds up. So I'm only going to talk about this real quickly. I don't want this to become a Jquery hate fest. That's not my intent. But the frameworks are also starting to become less and less relevant. So a couple reasons to potentially consider dumping Jquery if you haven't already. DOM traversal isn't that hard in vanilla JS anymore. That's a big one of those browsers are catching up. It's not that hard in modern browsers to interact with the DOM. IE10 and IE11 have eliminated most of the cross-browser compatibility issues we've dealt with historically. We shouldn't be doing really heavy-duty transitions and animations in JavaScript anymore, not talking about Canvas necessarily, but just in terms of your basic interactions. Those are better suited for CSS. Dependencies suck. If you can avoid them, all the better. Why have to load another library while you wait for it to load before you write your own code? And you can just impress your friends with your cool Jquery-less credibility, right? So we've got these preprocessors that have historically been doing these amazing things for us, but they've got their limitations. By the way, I just want to give a moment of silence to the actors in As Seen on TV commercials, who are a special kind of actor. I think this is the most, some of the best acting in the world. There's a subreddit called Where Did the Soda Go? That makes animated GIFs out of just the bad acting scene where the actor has some clumsy incident. And they just make animated GIFs out of them. So yeah, subscribe to that subreddit if you have not already. That is spectacular. So if we're trying to step away from this, if we're trying to decouple ourselves from these locked-in preprocessors, how do we go about that? Well, we throw in the word postprocessors. And before anybody asks, and if anybody has done any research on postprocessors at all, the first thing you've probably seen is postprocessors aren't postprocessors, they're still preprocessors. And to that I will say, you're right, and you're missing the point. They are absolutely preprocessors. There is nothing runtime about them. There is nothing after the fact about them. On the JavaScript side, transpiler might be the more accurate term, and that's actually the preferred term when we're talking about JavaScript. So it's not so much about when we're processing our code, it's what code we're processing or how we're processing our code. So what preprocessors and transpilers get us back to is the code that is written in the languages that we fell in love with when we all started doing front-end development in the first place. On the CSS end of things, we have pretty much one main candidate, and that is something called Post Css. On the JavaScript end of things, we actually have two options for transpilers. There's probably more, but big name anyway. On the left, you have Babel, used to be called 6to5. And on the right, that is not an Adobe product, despite the logo there. That is a product called Tracer that's actually maintained by Google. Most of my familiarity is on the Babel end, so that's what I'll be talking about. So you'll recall this preprocess that we talked about before. We write in a proprietary language, we run it through a task runner, we spit out CSS. Post-processing doesn't really change things that much, but it kind of changes everything at the same time. The big difference is right here. We write in standards-based code, or we write in proposed standards-based code. I'll talk about that in a second. We still have our task runner in this process. So whether that's Grunt or Gulp or whatever you're using, your task runner watches for the changes, and then it runs it through Post Css. Post Css in and of itself is basically also a task runner. It's just post-processing whatever you're telling it to process. And we spit out CSS. So we go from CSS to CSS. Instead of writing our at include for compass mixins or writing the SASS variable, we write display flex, and we write var -- color blue. I'll talk about the -- color blue syntax in just a minute. And I have some strong words on that syntax also. The end result is the same code. We're getting back the exact same thing that we got when we ran it through a preprocessor. But the difference is we wrote it in CSS. So maybe you're intrigued by this. Maybe this is looking pretty interesting. How do you get started? There's a chance maybe you already have and haven't realized it, because that's actually what happened with our team. Who's used auto prefixer before? A few show of hands there. So what you may not realize about auto prefixer is that it's actually part of the Post Css world. So auto prefixer is a really popular replacement for Compass's vendor prefix mix-ins. So instead of doing the add include, we run auto prefixer. It automatically adds vendor prefixes to our CSS3 properties. One key difference is you define which browsers should be supported via a config file. And this is a pretty fundamental difference from the way Compass works. Compass just makes some assumptions. Compass says these are the browsers we're going to support, these are the vendor prefixes. Depending on your version of Compass, that's basically what you're going to get output. There's some configuration there, don't get me wrong, but in general, that's the idea. With auto prefixer, you actually have a config file. It's configured in your build process that says which browsers you want to support. It cross-references that with the caniuse.com database of vendor prefixes. So not only are you defining what browsers you want to support, every time you build, you are cross-referencing that with a current database. So you're never out of date every time you build. And there's no need to memorize special function names. As you saw in that previous slide, if I want to do Flexbox, I say display flex, and I have Flexbox. I am writing it in the native CSS spec, in the proposed standards-based spec, and I let auto prefixer do everything in the background. I don't have to worry about vendor prefixes anymore. So my company started using, we were a SaaS shop. That was basically our workflow. And we found auto prefixer. We thought that was pretty cool. We were kind of running that on our own. We stopped writing Compass mix-ins. We thought, oh, auto prefixer is pretty cool. And then we started kind of learning about it. And it turns out auto prefixer is actually just one piece of a much, much bigger puzzle. And that is this Post Css ecosystem. So unlike SASS, Post Css is completely modular. Post Css itself is essentially a task runner that you plug in what you want to modify. So SASS I always equate to being kind of the buffet, right? Here's everything you can have, and some people do that at the buffet, right? I think Post Css is a little more like Chipotle. It empowers you to make your own choices of what you want to put on your CSS burrito. Oh, that's going to get tweeted and sound really stupid, isn't it? Or if you're like me, you just still ask for everything, and it's basically a buffet anyway. So a few advantages of Post Css. Write your CSS using CSS. Crazy concept, right? Use CSS3 with reckless abandon. Don't worry about what's supported anymore. Use CSS4 if you want to. Who cares if that's not actually a thing? And with the way CSS is actually ratified and approved in standards now, it may never be called CSS4. But you can use it, as weird as that sounds. If you download my slides, if you click that link, it's actually to a Post Css plugin called Post Css Next. And the entire purpose of Post Css Next is to allow you to write in just basically standards-based, if you can say that, CSS4 properties, and it takes care of the rest. So it sticks to standards as much as possible. It will work with your existing task runners. You do have to change your process around a little bit, but you're still using gulp or grunt or whatever you prefer to use. It's built on Node, and that's JavaScript. That means we don't have Ruby dependencies anymore. There's no more bundle. There's no more gem file, unless you have it for other reasons. For that reason, I'm going to argue that it's a little bit easier to debug. And it's also easier to extend, because if you can write JavaScript, you can write a Post Css plugin or a mixin. Post Css has a pretty robust API, so if you need to tack something onto it, it's basically just a JavaScript function to interact with it. And arguably faster compile times. If anybody originally moved from the Ruby version of Sass to libsass, you know that that's a bit faster in terms of compile times. Allegedly, Post Css is 40 times faster than Ruby Sass and 4 times faster than libsass. I say allegedly because the person making that claims is the inventor of Post Css. And there are actually some tests, JavaScript tests, like code tests that he has out on his website to prove this. I haven't run through them to verify his speed claims, but allegedly it's 40 times or 4 times faster. And countless plugins. So one of my big fears was, what's going to happen when we step into this world? Is there stuff there? And I had this initial reaction, because it's so comfortable living in Sass, right? It's such a comfortable world. There is life beyond Sass. You can get past that workflow and past that dependency. If you can do it in Sass, you can probably do it in Post Css. And I'm going to walk you through plugin by plugin kind of what we use. There's a lot more out there, but I'll show you kind of our workflow. First one I want to talk about is partials and globbing. Sort of this idea. We mentioned native importing, the ability to say, I want to pull in this file and have it automatically pull in. On that front, we use a plugin called Post Css import. And Post Css import will actually loop through a series of @import statements in your in your CSS file and compile that out to compiled code. The process of globbing, in other words, watching a directory or a directory of directories of folders and have it grab through all of those and pull your code in, is a little controversial on the Sass side. The creator of Sass actually said that's a really terrible idea because you lose some of the fine-grained control of load order. I prefer it personally. If you want to do that, there's a plugin called Grunt Sass Globbing that it has Sass in the name, but actually works just fine with Post Css. In fact, I've talked to the creator about changing the name, but I don't think they're doing it. Nesting, really popular feature in Sass. The ability to say, for example, we have our primary nav, and then maybe we want to nest within there so we don't have to repeat primary nav over and over. Creates some code cleanliness and a little bit easier to read, arguably. On that front, we use a plugin called Post Css Nested. Just like Sass, it's not always a great idea, right? You have to be aware of what your nesting is spitting out in terms of output code. But if what you want to write is that, it's pretty easy to do. This is the fun one. Post Css custom properties. A really, really great opportunity to start writing some really ugly code. So this is a little bit hard to see, but you'll see here that I am scoping with the colon root. Then I write my variable name, which is written as -- color blue. And you'll see my solution there. When I want to use that, I say var and then -- color blue. It's ugly. It's also going to be standard. That is the proposed syntax by the W3C for how native CSS variables will work. And variables are already supported in production Firefox. So this is a real thing. This is coming, and it's coming pretty quick. If that just grosses you out and you don't want to be on that end of things, if you are okay writing in a more proprietary syntax or a more, I guess you could say non-standard, even though it's not quite standard yet, there is a plugin called Post Css Simple Vars. you can get back to writing your $signs. If you have an existing project that you're trying to swap out Post Css and you don't want to go through and rewrite every variable in your build, Post Css simple vars will keep that the same. Color, like variables, you can now follow the proposed CSS color module spec, and that is a really powerful spec. There's a lot of really cool stuff that we're going to be able to do with color in the very near future. You can work with RGBA values, hex values, and then 3 that I've barely touched, HSL, HSV, and HWB. There's a plugin for that, and it's actually been split out into 4 separate plugins, depending on what your use case is, but it falls under this umbrella term of Post CSS color. This also takes a little bit of getting used to. You write color, then you pass in the color. I'm not using a hex here, I'm just saying key name of red. And then I'm saying A of 90%, so alpha of 90%. This is basically an RGBA value that lets me work with hex or whatever I want to work with. Doesn't seem too hideous there until you combine it with a variable. And then you have color, parentheses, var, parentheses, dash, dash, color red, parentheses, A, parentheses, 90, parentheses, parentheses. It takes a little bit of getting used to. I don't necessarily love the syntax, but again, it's standard, or it's going to be standard. And it really doesn't take that long to get used to. Actually, I've had to go back and work on some SASS projects now, and I completely forget how I'm supposed to write them. Seems like gross syntax, but you get used to it pretty quickly. Mix-ins and extends. I will say SASS probably wins this one. There's some built-in SASS functionality that's pretty powerful. But there are plugins out there that can do this for Post CSS. I prefer one that's called Post CSS Mix-ins. And for really basic arithmetic, I use something called Post CSS Calc, which will actually take a calc declaration in your CSS, and if it can pre-process that, obviously depending on what you're trying to calculate, that may not be possible, it will do that so you're never putting that burden on your users. Also with mix-ins, ask yourself, am I writing too complex of mix-ins in the first place? I've seen a lot of projects where people have come up with these really, really elaborate, impressive mix-ins, but that code is very, very difficult to hand off to somebody else. Because the learning curve on that becomes really steep, and it's not always really well documented how those mix-ins are meant to work. So that's Post CSS. I have about 8 minutes here, so I'm going to have to go a little fast through this, but let's talk real quick about JavaScript. In case you haven't heard by now, ECMAScript 6 is a thing, right? This is approved standard now. That's seizure-inducing. I'll get off that really quick. So we have ECMA 6 as the current standard of JavaScript now. So remember this list of things that we don't get with JavaScript up until ES6. Module loading, type coercion, that one still is a little questionable. And then all the syntactic sugar that's really handy. Interpolation, fat arrow functions, classes, constants, destructuring. ES6 fixes basically all that stuff. But some of you may already be going down this line. I see this happening a lot faster than the Post CSS stuff. You might be saying, well, I can't use ES6 today, right? Well, you can, thanks in large part to Babel and Tracer. And I'm very much on the Babel side of things here. So this lets us write ES6 code using things like import and export statements. There's our module loading. Constants, block level scoped variables, so let instead of var. Template strings, multi-line template strings. You'll see my ticks right here that actually let me create this template string. And then I just have a variable here within my template string that lets us do interpolation. Nothing real crazy here, but cool stuff that it's there. And import and export will completely change your life once you get into it. And Babel transpiles that all into ES5 level code that will run in any modern browser. This will work with all of your existing JavaScript loaders. We are a System.js shop, which is really hard to configure, but really great once you get it done. But it will work just fine with Require, or whether you're on the Browserify or Webpack end of things. If anybody wants to chat system later, I'd love to. We're doing some interesting stuff with that. It'll also work with any sort of module format that you want to load, whether that's common, AMD, UMD, or system, which we like system because you can actually write in native ES6 syntax, and it transpiles out to something that'll work. In a perfect world, someday, we might even be able to turn off all of our transpilers, and our next-gen code is just going to work. But let's be honest, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. And that's not necessarily the point. and I see this argued a lot, that you're still processing this code. That's a valid argument, but it does get us a lot closer to the metal and a lot closer to writing code that is standards-based and getting back to the languages that we love. So on the JavaScript end of things, there's really no reason at this point that you shouldn't be writing ES6 code. If you're on a large-scale project that retrofitting might be difficult, that might be a different case. But even in that case, there's a lot of ways to make this work pretty simply. So in conclusion, I think front-end development is really at a crossroads right now. We're not that far away from seeing these next-generation CSS and JavaScript features being natively supported in browsers and also becoming standard. And I think things like CSS variable is a perfect example of that. It's already showing up out in the wild as a standard, and it's already out there as a supported feature. So until that happens, it's a really, really good time to get as close to real code as you possibly can in your production process and start stepping away from these proprietary languages and preprocessors that are always going to require this preprocessing step. I think post-process CSS is a bit more on the arguable side of things. There are definitely some arguments to be made for the size of community, for example, or the flexibility or the scale of SASS. However, I think it's very realistic to start stepping into a post-CSS workflow already. And I'd say it's a great time to do that to get closer to the metal and closer to writing actual CSS again. On the JavaScript front, like I said, switching to transpiled JavaScript is practically a no-brainer at this point. If you can work this into your workflow and it's a realistic thing for you, do it now. Babel's fantastic. So as developers, we really have the power and the responsibility to drive innovation. And we're the ones who are going to tell the standards makers and the browser manufacturers where we want development to go. We want to get away from these proprietary languages and push native support and web standards in the correct direction. And the only way we can really do that, it's kind of like voting with your dollar, is doing it by how you write your code, right? And the people who are making the standards, as I hope I've demonstrated, are paying attention. And that's all I've got. Thank you guys for listening. Got my slides and my Twitter up there. So. I've got looks like about 2 or 3 minutes for questions. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer. Yes, sir. Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing. But yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned ES6 being this, or ES6 and Babel being this sort of magical thing. It doesn't account for everything in future JavaScript and ES6 that can be run in current browsers. Trying to think of examples off the top of my head. Is there any you're thinking of? Yeah, I'm kind of blanking out too. There are a couple ES6 features that there's basically nothing ES5 equivalent that Babel can convert back to. So that's a good point. I'd say don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's still worth ES6 and Babel and transpiling for all the other features you get, but you're absolutely right. There may be some limitations on certain ES6 features that you can't use. I know on a couple of them there are some runtime libraries, basically polyfills, that can fill in a couple of things, but that's a question of whether you want to do a runtime solution that would kind of polyfill in something. It might just be better to write it a different way at this point, but yeah, sorry, I can't think of very specific examples at this moment, but I know there are a couple features that aren't supported, so yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What's your opinion on JS controlled CSS?
You're talking like React and styling in React and that sort of thing? I don't have a ton of experience with it myself. Personally, I know there's kind of a movement for sure about is CSS even the appropriate language anymore for writing styles? Is it a dated language, and should we be moving towards doing that all in JavaScript? As much as I sound like I'm a big, moving towards the future kind of guy, I still see a lot of value in CSS. I think I still think it's the correct way to write CSS. I like that separation of concerns, and I appreciate everything React does with, getting JavaScript and HTML a lot closer together. I guess I still feel like CSS has its place outside of that environment, but that's probably personal opinion more than anything. So, other questions? Yes, sir. Sorry, it's really loud up here.
For TypeScript, so how does that
TypeScript fits in here?
Oh, for TypeScript. I don't have a ton of experience with TypeScript. I know that it will work through Babel pretty easily. Has anybody else tried that maybe we could connect with after the talk? That's done like transpiling with Babel and has TypeScript in the mix? Okay. No, sorry. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Any what experience? Oh, in terms of, that's actually a really good question. So his question was, how do you debug your code when you're going from ES6 to something that you're not really controlling the output on? That's actually a great question. What we've done at this point, and at the point that Babel gets more robust and we really just have full trust in it, we might do away with this step. We actually built a trans step into our build process so that when our code is transpiled, it goes first to a transpiled directory. So we're spitting out our transpiled code so that we can actually see how that code works. And then we can basically just hot swap in those files for the minified and concatenated code so that we can actually see how that code has been transpiled out. So that helps a lot with that because you can basically just see the code in its full form in this sort of intermediate step, I guess you'd say. So that's been our solution. There's probably more elegant solutions out there, but that's worked pretty well for us. So. Yes?
Do you find that you get more or less runtime errors or less?
On the JavaScript end of things? Not really a noticeable difference, actually. I'd say, yeah, I think so. I think we've had pretty good luck with Post Css, or with Babel stuff. I haven't noticed any huge issues. Babel in itself is a pretty well supported transpiler at this point. So, yeah. I think I'm out of time, but yeah, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to come up after the talk. So, thank you guys.